Have you ever heard somebody say, I wanted to have a natural birth, but I had to end up getting a C-section? Over 90% of low-risk, healthy pregnant women are able to have a non-medicalized birth, but they end up having a medicalized birth because of something called the labor funnel. Today we're going to be talking about the labor funnel, what it is, and how you can avoid it. So, a lot of women have expressed this passion or desire to have a natural birth. They go in and things get fuzzy and they come out on the other side with a C-section or maybe an epidural, forceps delivery, something of this nature, an episiotomy, and they're scratching their head wondering, how did this happen? I really wanted that natural birth. So we're gonna break down what is happening across the country, in other countries too, I'm sure, called the labor funnel. So basically the labor funnel is a domino effect. One medical intervention that leads to another intervention that leads to another intervention, and then you wake up and you had a C-section. So here's an example of what that might look like. So you have a healthy, low-risk pregnant woman. Let's just say her name is Kiana. So Kiana goes into the hospital, she's in labor, she's in active labor, she gets admitted, right? And so the first thing they do is they hook her up to a fetal monitor. And this will track the baby's heart rate and track her contractions as well. So now that she has this on her belly, she's told to lay or sit in the bed, and she's not allowed to get up and move around that much. So every time she moves around, a nurse comes in and says, you have to sit down or you have to lay down so that we can keep track of the baby through this Doppler that's strapped to your belly. Now, she can't move around a lot. And let's say that she's been in labor for about 18 hours. Now, typically, most hospitals want you to give birth within 24 hours. Now, she's getting close to that 24-hour mark. She can't move around, so her contractions are feeling a lot more painful than they were when she was able to move around. So the nurse keeps asking her if she wants an epidural. Now, at this point, she's really exhausted, she's really tired, but she's told that she cannot eat or drink. All she can have is ice chips, and that ain't doing it for her. So at this point, she's getting even more frustrated. So then a doctor comes in to check her progress, see how far along she is, and to her surprise, she's only 6 centimeters. So now she's exhausted and she's frustrated because she thought this was gonna be over soon, and now she feels like I'm only 6 centimeters, maybe it's gonna be a lot longer. So because she's only at 6 centimeters and she's been in labor for 20 hours at this point, now her doctors are telling her that she needs to have her labor augmented so this baby can be born before the 24-hour mark. Of course, she doesn't really understand why 24 hours is so important, but they're telling her that it's necessary for the baby to get out within 24 hours of her waters being broken. So she says okay, and she receives a drug called Pitocin. Now, Pitocin is going to make her uterus contract stronger and longer and harder than it would naturally on its own. And so because she's already exhausted, she's already feeling frustrated and a little upset, she can't move around to get through these really intense contractions, and she's hungry and just wants something to eat. She finally is just like, I can't do it anymore. Give me the epidural. So in comes the anesthesiologist. Luckily, they're right on her floor, ready to give her an epidural. And the epidural, when she receives it, begins to stress the baby out. The baby has already been under the stress of the Pitocin, and now it's getting another drug via the epidural. And so the baby's heart rate begins to drop. At this point, nurses rushing in, telling her that she has to have an emergency C-section and get that baby out before the baby dies. And I do want to add a side note that a lot of nurses and doctors, obstetricians are using that language, like your baby might die. And that is very severe language to use with a mother who is laboring. That's a whole nother video. So that was just one example of how you could end up going into the labor funnel, going in for natural birth, coming out with a very medicalized experience. But let's look back at Kiana and see what she could have done differently to avoid these things. So number one, Kiana should have chose a provider that was on the same page as her as far as natural birth. So if you want to go unmedicated, no epidural, no Pitocin, none of that, you would have a better chances doing a home birth where that's not even available, or at least going to a birth center where that's not readily available unless it's for very rare cases or emergency reasons. So number two, Kiana definitely needed to do her homework. She needed to understand that just by being hooked up to a fetal monitor and being told to sit down in the bed, it would have been more difficult for her to get through her contractions, along with the fact that if she was exhausted and just feeling like she needed a boost of energy, it would have been better for her to actually eat so she could get more energy to keep laboring. There's a whole slew of information on evidence-based-birth.com that I will link below that talks about why eating in labor is completely fine. Kiana needed to speak up. See, it's one thing to have information, but it's a whole nother thing to have that information and use it and speak up and say, this is what I want, this is what I don't want. Maybe she didn't need to be hooked up to the fetal monitoring machine. Maybe she didn't want to stay in bed and she knew that that's just protocol. It's not really a rule that I have to follow. I can move my body if I need to. So I hope this video was helpful in explaining what the labor funnel is. If you have any questions about it, be sure to leave them down below. And here is a visual representation of what the labor funnel or the Cascade of Interventions looks like. I want you to keep in mind that this can happen in various different ways, not just with electronic fetal monitoring. Sometimes this can happen with induction or various other scenarios, but this is a good example to keep in mind. The best way to avoid the labor funnel is to, number one, think ahead. If you're going to accept a medical intervention, is that going to get you closer to a natural birth, and is it necessary? Secondly, ask questions. Make sure that you are totally clear on what is happening. And lastly, take a moment to take a deep breath and think. Unless it's a medical emergency, you should be able to ask your provider to give you some space and think over your options before you make your final decision.